The fastest accelerating supermoto in the world has a new sound. But can it really compete with 450s? Absolutely, it can. But back up. What is this electric supermoto really? Let's answer some of the most common questions I get about this bike. Number one, what is that even? Well, originally this was a static Varg motocross bike. Now, static Varg means strong wolf in Swedish, but actually the company is based in Spain. I believe the reason it has a Swedish name is because the founder and CEO is Swedish. Number two, how fast is it? Well, right now it does 109 miles per hour, so it has 80 horsepower, and it weighs around 120 kilograms in my current Supermoto setup. For reference, my KTM 450 SMR weighs 112 kilograms fueled up and has 63 horsepower. It does around 106 miles per hour. Number three, how long does the battery actually last? In 80 horsepower mode at full race pace in Supermoto, I can go around 15 to 20 minutes before the bike starts overheating. Once it does, it limits power to about 60 horsepower. In reality, that means that I can race an entire Supermoto race no problem whatsoever. Number four, how long does it take to charge the bike? To go from 30 to 100% takes around 70 minutes if you charge it at 240 volts. If you're charging at 110 volts, it's gonna take double that. Number five, how is it to ride as a Supermoto? Well, it feels pretty much identical to my 450 SMR. The only difference is that it does feel a little bit lighter in the dirt, even though it is actually heavier. I believe it is because it doesn't have as much rotating mass in the engine, which makes it easier to flick this bike over. Number six, what have you done to the bike to make it into the Supermoto racing machine? Well, let's talk about the bike. Let's start in the front and then work our way back. So the entire front end is actually from a KTM MTR S1GP race bike. So it's a 16-inch Cobra wheel with a 16-inch Michelin Power Supermoto tire on it. It has SPS fork feet, double biting calipers and discs. And then the forks are a very special setup. They're Showa forks, but they're set up by Laner over in Italy specifically for Supermoto. The triple clamps are from X-Trig and they're set up to have 15 millimeters of offset. Now the offset in the triple tree and the offset in the fork feet give an ideal trail for Supermoto. On the handlebars, I can start and stop the bike. I can also change between 5 preset modes that I select myself. The modes you can set up are based on power as well as regen braking, aka engine braking. So you can select however many horsepower and how much engine braking you want on the bike. Now in Supermoto race mode, I run this at 80 horsepower and 35% regen braking. I also have the rear brake on the handlebars because there's no clutch. So it's a lot easier to handle the bike if you can always have your feet on top of the pegs. I also have an aim solo lap timer so I can keep track of how I'm doing. Lastly, the master cylinder that I use is a Brembo RCS 15mm. Alright, let's talk about the shock. So I use a special Laner shock that's set up specifically for Supermoto. It is about 10 millimeters longer than the stock shock that goes on this bike. To fit with that, I'm also using an KTM MTR knuckle on the linkage. So why do I use this setup? Well, this setup means that the bike is much more stiff in the initial part of the travel. Or in other words, I get much more anti-squat when I'm out on the asphalt. Now, why do you want that? Well, usually if you ride a dirt bike on asphalt with all that grip, the bike is going to squat significantly when you accelerate. And this means you get less grip on the rear. And the bike also gets a really weird geometry because it gets really rear heavy when you're accelerating. And you don't want that. So it behaves really well on the asphalt, but it also behaves really well in the dirt with this setup. Now, why is that? Well, because it is so stiff in the beginning of the travel, it means I can use a softer spring for the shock. And that means that it will behave much better in the dirt section. Now for sag, I set it at 80 millimeters with me on top of the bike and all the gear. For the rear wheel, I have a 17-inch FS450 wheel and a 17-inch Michelin tire to go with it. The sprocket setup is going to be very important for Supermoto. So when I run it in 80 HP mode, I have a 15-tooth front sprocket and a 43-tooth rear sprocket. This gives it power across the speed range, which is very important. Question number 7, and one of the most popular questions. Should this bike really be allowed to race against 450s? I absolutely think so. Now, the reason for this is that it does have a little bit more horsepower, so it accelerates faster than a 450 0 to 60, but it is also a little bit heavier. Overall, it is not significantly faster than 450s, but in motorcycle racing, it is still 90% rider, 10% motorcycle. So should you get this bike? Well, I think you should get this bike if you want to ride motocross with it. For that, it is an absolutely amazing bike. If you want to get this bike for Supermoto, I think you should get this if you want to race with the bike. If you only want to use it for track days, I'm not sure I would recommend this bike. The reason for that is that if you take this bike out for a really long session, bring it in, charge it back up, and then take it out again, you're going to overheat the bike and it's going to limit the amount of horsepower that you get out of it. So for a practice bike where you're doing session after session after session, I still think you should get a 450cc gas bike. Remember to subscribe to my channel. There's always something new to learn.
It's gotta be against the law to look this damn good.